The subcommittee will come to order. Our subject this morning is comprehensive reform of the Universal Service High Cost Fund, a matter on which the subcommittee will act in the near future. Universal service support is as essential to our national economic future as it has been historically. In this time when electronic communications are at the very heart of the national economy, it is perhaps more essential than ever before that all Americans remain connected. Affordable telephone service not only benefits the individual users of that service, but at a time when electronic commerce and communications are central to national economic performance, having all of America connected should be a priority for rural and metropolitan residents alike. The Universal Service Fund that assures affordable rural telephone service has come under increasing pressure, and comprehensive reform is now a necessity. New technologies and new business plans are combining to diminish the long-distance revenues that have historically been relied upon in order to support universal service. And broadband has emerged as a critical part of our telecommunications infrastructure. In reforming the USF, other funding sources must be tapped, and new controls must be placed on expenditures from the fund. We should also re-examine which networks and services deserve USF support. In an effort to achieve these goals in a manner that is fair to the rural telephone companies that are the net beneficiaries of USF support and the large regional carriers that are net contributors into the fund, my colleague from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, and I have worked together for the last 3 years and in the last Congress introduced a comprehensive reform bill based on that 3 years of effort. We consulted with dozens of stakeholders and sought consensus among various competing interests. We intend to continue that process this year and shortly will introduce a revised version of that legislation. And we welcome the suggestions and the co-sponsorship of our measure by other members of the subcommittee on a bipartisan basis. Our goal is to expand the revenue base for the fund. We would give the FCC discretion to use a revenues or a numbers approach to contributions or some combination of those two approaches. We would allow the assessment for the fund of intrastate as well as interstate revenues. We would also impose strict limitations on growth of the fund by capping the entire fund and basing payments on a carrier's actual costs rather than the costs of the incumbent telecommunications carrier in the region. We would improve the efficiency of expenditures from the fund by requiring that all recipients meet minimum FCC standards in order to receive support. We would also future-proof the fund by requiring that all recipients offer broadband at preset minimum speeds. To receive support, that broadband offering would be a condition. Broadband is to communities today what electricity and basic telephone service were 100 years ago. It is the new essential infrastructure for the commercial success of all communities and clearly deserving, in my view, of USF support. Other elements of our measure would include a better targeting of support to high-cost areas by switching from statewide to wire center averaging, fixing the phantom traffic problem by requiring carriers to pass through call identifying information, making rural exchanges more marketable for telephone companies that may desire to sell them by repairing the parent trap, and making permanent the Anti-Deficiency Act exemption to the Universal Service Fund rather than requiring an annual appropriations waiver of that ADA provision, which happens at the present time. There are other matters that I think we should consider and about which I would welcome the insights of our distinguished panel this morning. For example, how, if at all, should the $7.2 billion of broadband stimulus money affect inclusion of broadband in the universal service reform measure? Another question is, when we eliminate the identical support rule, how should the actual costs of the recipients of universal service funding be calculated? As another question, should we eliminate the distinction between rural and non-rural carriers, presently embedded as a consequence of an FCC order? I hope that our witnesses will address this morning these and other matters. I want to thank today's witnesses for their participation, for preparing their testimony and engaging in this important discussion with us. And I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, the ranking Republican of our subcommittee, Mr. Stearns, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. There's been many ideas, including your legislation, has been discussed, and so I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning and hearing how best to move forward. I think all of us this morning agree that the USF needs to be reformed and reformed quickly. The system is fraught with waste, fraud, and abuse, in our opinion. A major overhaul is necessary. So a question before us this morning is, what are the appropriate goals of the program? Of course, how best do we achieve them? The 1996 Telecom Act codified universal service, but the concept goes back decades earlier to a time when there was really only one phone company. Now the landscape looks a whole lot different, yet the fund is still administered by outdated rules. This hearing will focus on the High Cost Fund, the largest component of the USF and the program most in need of reform. The cost of this fund has more than tripled in the last decade, soaring from $1.3 billion in 1997 to almost $4.5 billion last year. The FCC's high-cost rules do not reflect the dramatic changes in the marketplace, including multi-facilities-based providers entering markets throughout the nation. Now, nearly the entire country has access to phone service. We have more competition and better technology than ever before. Yet the Universal Service Fund has grown out of control and can continue to do so unless we adopt meaningful reforms. The universal service fees have topped 11% of the consumer's monthly bill. Accordingly, there is a need to reform the program away from subsidies, in our opinion, that may no longer be necessary as technology and services improve and become more and more widespread. Instead, we need to move towards a solution that ensures the goals of universal service but minimizes consumer cost. Without fundamental reform, now is not the time to expand the fund to include just broadband. The recently enacted stimulus package already provides $7 billion, an entire year's worth of USF, to bring broadband to unserved areas. It'll take at least 2 years for the stimulus money to be fully distributed and the program to be completely implemented. For now, let's take the 2 years while the stimulus package is being used and examine the effectiveness of the current program. Instead of adding new broadband requirements to universal service, we should engage in oversight, evaluation of these existing programs. In addition, we should impose a firm cap to prevent uncontrolled growth in the fund. With a limitless pool of money, carriers have little incentive to operate more efficiently. The subsidy chills innovation by propping up older technologies and carriers and making it harder for new innovators to compete. Throwing additional money at this crumbling program makes no sense. Moreover, performance measurements are needed to ensure we are getting results from the over $50 billion we have spent in the last decade. What impact are these funds having when everyone already has access to phone service? This type of transparency and accountability goes a long way towards preventing abuse. To really add competitive pressure, however, we also need to move to market-based mechanisms that are technology neutral and fund the carrier that can provide the most effective service in that area. A report by the GAO shows that the FCC needs to improve oversight and management of the USF. The GAO has also criticized the FCC for failing to develop specific performance goals and measurements for this high-cost program. One question we might ask is, how much has been lost to waste, fraud, and abuse? The FCC's Inspector General found error rates of close to 25% in the high-cost fund, which translates to improper payments of approximately $1 billion. The Inspector General also found that all 4 universal service programs to be, quote, at risk. We need to take a hard look at this program and institute real reform. So, Mr. Chairman, again, commend you for having this hearing to examine the goals and assess the results of the existing program. We all agree that the system needs reform. I hope they are able to work together towards a solution that is fair to all consumers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Stupak, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher, and thank you for holding this hearing on how we should reform the Universal Service Fund. I appreciate that we're taking up this issue quickly, considering we almost had the FCC make dramatic changes to the program late last year. USF is important to rural Americans, so significant changes to the program should come from Congress, where it can be done in an open manner with direct member input through the legislative process, not with the FCC. Now, that this is not to say that this will be an easy process, since there are many different views on how we should reform USF. But the one thing I think we can all agree on is that the USF should be reformed to promote broadband deployment. Communities that lack broadband access in today's world are at a disadvantage on all fronts. Businesses without broadband cannot compete in a globalized market. Schools without broadband cannot properly prepare their students today for the workforce of tomorrow. And hospitals without broadband cannot access the latest advances in telemedicine. Reforming USF should mean retooling it so it reflects advancements in technology to meet the needs of tomorrow's economy. Reform should not be mischaracterized as a means to cut overall federal investment into our rural communities. We cannot attain more broadband deployment with a smaller investment or a weaker support structure for rural telecommunications. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can modernize the USF to continue meeting its goal of providing universally accessible and affordable telecommunications for all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remaining 20 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stupak. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Blunt, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today, and have the opportunity to hear from this group of really well-grounded and distinguished witnesses. I know this is an area, Mr. Chairman, where you've shown great leadership in the past, and I know all the members of the subcommittee are looking forward to working with you to see if we can find ways to reform and update the Universal Service Fund. We all understand the fund needs serious reform. The cost of the program soared, tripling in the past 12 years alone, and the impact on consumers is uneven and often arduous. Allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse have arisen, and no suitable accounting mechanism exists to appropriately monitor where the money is going. In short, this program is broken, and the Congress should act. However, it should act responsibly and within the mission of ensuring that valuable services remain available to parts of the country that need it. Congress should carefully consider whether it's appropriate to add new components such as broadband access to the Universal Service Fund. We need to stop the soaring cost of the program, but do it in a way that ensures that unserved communities continue to get service where the market is challenged to deliver it. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. I also want to thank both Mr. Terry and Mr. Barton, our full committee ranking member, for their leadership on this issue. Most importantly, I want to thank our witnesses today who come with incredible information on this topic. I look forward to a bipartisan bill to address this program.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blunt. That's my goal as well. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on universal service. I hope that we're able to draw some conclusions after this hearing that will help us expedite the process to making sure that all Americans are able to communicate with each other however they choose. At our subcommittee's last hearing on this issue, I said that the Universal Service Fund's best purpose, as we conceived it in the Telecom Act in 1996, had fundamentally changed. At that time, I said that, quote, we need to completely reform the fund by moving away from subsidizing telephone service and instead put our money towards the broadband future. For now, I'll call this needed reform Universal Service 2.0. Mr. Chairman, Universal Service 2.0 means that all Americans have access and are able to use fast broadband. Universal Service 2.0 recognizes that using cost-efficient technologies is critical when some parts of the country are asked to pay for others. Universal Service 2.0 recognizes that competition is still vital to drive down consumer prices and required subsidies. And, Mr. Chairman, Universal Service 2.0 means that local governments have a role to play. And I want to say to you, Mr. Chairman, that I will join you in educating anyone at today's witness table that disagrees that they do. Thanks, and I'll yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, is next. I believe he has departed, at least temporarily. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing on Universal Service Fund. I've enjoyed our time working together to develop this bill and the framework. I set out several years ago, almost 4 years ago, to reform USF because I felt that the principles and goals of universal service are relevant today just as they were at the origination of this program. However, the Universal Service Fund had failed to adapt to the changing telecommunications environment. The fact that broadband is still not still not a supported goal of USF reflects the need for reform. This FCC has built a tremendous record on USF reform over the last few years, and now it's time for this committee to act. I'll note that I represent an urban-suburban area. I have more concrete than grass in my district, yet I see the need to continue universal service and modernize it. I recognize the importance of ubiquitous broadband network and the value my constituents receive from being able to connect to anyone, anywhere in the country, and hope that my colleagues do too. Now, as we move forward on reform, we must not lose sight that USF is about providing customers in all regions of the nation living in rural, insular, and high-cost areas access to affordable telecommunications and information services. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terry, and thank you for your outstanding work on this measure. The gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Bocher and Ranking Member Stearns, as a representative of a district that is a high-cost insular area, which reportedly received $25.5 million in high-cost support in 2007 and has benefited from the other programs as well. I thank you for holding this hearing and for both of your long-term legislative efforts to try to keep the Universal Service Fund in sync with a rapidly changing landscape. I think everyone is agreed on a need for reform, but also to preserving the intent codified in 1996 that all consumers across our nation should have access to the broad spectrum of communication possibilities at affordable rates, although with some expansion of that. The broadband provisions in the recent recovery package will give a welcome boost to the goal of making technology equally accessible to everyone everywhere, as well as create more demand for broadband as we look to transform our healthcare system, beginning with health information technology. And so on the areas that present challenges to taking the Universal Service Fund into the 21st century, I look forward to the testimonies and welcome our panelists this morning.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christensen. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Deal, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses, and in order to expedite the hearing of their testimony, I'll waive my opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Deal. We'll be pleased to add 2 minutes to your time for questioning our witnesses. The chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the subcommittee is beginning its review today of the nation's Universal Service Fund. I suspect that we all agree that the program is in need of repair and that the high-cost fund is a good place to start. I'd like to outline a few principles that will guide me during this process. First, I believe the goals of universal service are as important now in the age of broadband as they have ever been. Simply put, we cannot allow any part of the country, urban or rural, to be left behind. Second, we need to modify the program by looking forward, not by looking back. We need a universal service fund that supports the broadband networks of the future. uses public money wisely and efficiently, and spreads responsibility for the program as broadly and equitably as possible. Third, we must recognize that public obligations accompany public money. The $7 billion Universal Service Fund is financed by consumers. Service providers are simply conduits that transfer to the fund an 11% fee on top of the ordinary charges for the long-distance and international calls. We should ensure that recipients of these public funds meet certain obligations that benefit the consumers who pay these fees. For example, last Congress I introduced legislation to require wireless companies that receive USF subsidies to open their networks to other carriers for roaming purposes. I plan to reintroduce that measure shortly. Going forward, this committee will look closely at whether additional public interest conditions are appropriate. Fourth, we must ensure full accountability and transparency in this program. As GAO concluded in a June 2008 report, despite the investment of over $30 billion in the high-cost fund over the last 12 years, there are no data to show what this massive investment has produced. I know Ranking Member Barton feels strongly about this point, and I look forward to working with him and other committee members who share our concern about performance measures and potential waste, fraud, and abuse. As chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform during the last Congress, I asked the FCC to provide a list of the 10 largest recipients of high-cost program subsidy dollars for 2006 through 2008, as well as a list of the 10 largest per-line subsidies by location for 2006 and 2007. This was not secret information, but it had not been collected or released in this format before. The results of this inquiry raised additional questions about the high-cost program. For instance, 3 companies in Hawaii, Sandwich Isle Communications, Sprint Nextel, and Mobi PCS, each receive a subsidy of close to $13,000 a year per line to serve the same insular area. Over the past 3 years, these 3 companies received a total of more than $120 million in support. Under current rules, a single household in this part of Hawaii might have a landline phone connection from Sandwich Isle Communications, a wireless phone from Sprint Nextel, and a wireless phone from Mobi PCS, resulting in a federal subsidy of $39,000 per year. As we consider reforms to the high-cost fund, we should ask tough questions and be open to creative solutions. For example, where is the money going and to whom? Is this really the best use of public dollars? Are companies adequately demonstrating that funds are being used for their intended purposes? Are there less expensive ways to provide service by using different technologies? Should we consider competitive bidding for what are, in effect, government contracts? For how long and at what level should carriers be supported after they build facilities? Should we consider requiring state matching grants? Now that over 90% of American households have access to wireline broadband, should we consider shifting the fund to also support consumer adoption of broadband? I know universal service legislation is a priority for you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with you, Ranking Members Stern and Barton, and the other members of this committee to figure out the best way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you and others on this committee on a bipartisan basis to achieve those goals. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Shadegg, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I want to begin by welcoming Mr. Steve Davis, the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Government Relations for Quest Communications. Quest plays a large role in my congressional district, and I look forward to his testimony as well as that of the other witnesses. I'd like to associate my remarks or my views with the remarks of the ranking member, Mr. Stearns. I believe he articulated my views here well. I would also like to commend Congressman Lee Terry and Ranking Member Barton for their work in this area. I look forward to the discussion of the Universal Service Fund and to learning ways in which we should improve and reform the system. We've come a long way since the concept of a universal service fund first came forward. We have worked as a nation to ensure that affordable basic telecommunications services are available to everyone, regardless of where they live. But we are now at a crossroads as our technology evolves and improves, and I believe it is essential that we reevaluate the Universal Service Fund and how it is used. It is clear that some reform is necessary, and given the current status of our economy, we must find ways to make the system more cost-effective. An audit as of from July 2006 to June 2007 revealed that roughly $1 billion of Universal Service funds were awarded erroneously. We simply cannot afford nor defend that kind of waste in our system. We must find ways to work to make sure that these errors do not occur in the future, because they will only hurt our economy and our constituents. I very much look forward to the testimony of our witnesses here today on how we can improve the system and use technology to make it better serve the nation at a more economical cost. And again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shadegg. The gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Two things. It's mostly been said, but one, the need is enormous, and it has to include broadband. That would make a huge difference everywhere, but especially to rural states like Vermont. We get many companies that can decide whether to come to Vermont or not, depending on whether in the rural area they want to locate, there's access to broadband. Second, we have to reform the amount of money and how it's being spent, how it's being deployed. It's been said. But just the witnesses here at this table represent companies who've received in the range of $5 billion for the Universal Fund. And the question, obviously, is to the users, to your customers, are you using that money well? Are you getting the job done? And you face a tension because on the one hand you've got an obligation to the shareholders of your company that suggests that you maximize profit, but on the other hand you have a public trust, and that requires that you extend access to this essential utility service to every single American. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and the members of the committee to improve this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Welsh. The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to waive my opening statement in lieu of more time with the questioning period.
Thank you very much, Mr. Walden. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will ask unanimous consent to submit my opening statement for the record and waive at this time.
Without objection, the opening statements of all members who desire to submit them will be received for the record, and the gentleman, the chair thanks the gentlelady. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real brief. It's great to have the panel. We need to move on legislation. Broadband deployment is key in rural America. I represent 30 counties, parts of 30 of 102 in the state of Illinois, so this has been very helpful. I also co-chair with Congresswoman Eshoo the E911 caucus. You know, cellular delivery and location identification is critical to rural America, especially when health and safety issues are concerned. We have some challenges as we move forward, Mr. Chairman, but I look forward to working with you as we make those challenges and accept those and move forward. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shimkus. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Wiener, is recognized for 2 minutes.
In the interest of more time for questions, I yield my opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Wiener. The gentleman from California, Mr. McNary, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we certainly have seen a tremendous change in the technology since the last legislation on this in 1996. It was difficult then to foresee what we would be having now, and it's going to be hard for us to foresee what we're going to see in the next 10 years. So we're going to look to you all to give us guidance on that. We're going to work on both sides of the aisle, and we'll come up with some good legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McNary. Mr. Rush from Illinois is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I think I'll defer for an additional 2 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Rush.